Welcome to the Starting Well podcast. Whether you are a new pastor or you're beginning to serve in a new church, this podcast is designed to help you start well. I'm your host, Jason Lowe, and I serve as a regional consultant with the Kentucky Baptist Convention. And I am so glad that you've joined us for this episode. Let's get started. If I were to ask you, what's the most frequent or most common type of nightmare that you have? How would you answer that question? I know that's a very strange, odd question to ask to begin a podcast episode, but think about it just for a second. What is the most frequent nightmare that you have? A study was done a couple years ago that asked that very question of a lot of people, and some of the most popular answers, maybe you've experienced some of these types of nightmares, were a person falling or being chased or a death in the family or feeling lost or trapped. All of those were in the top 3 or 4 types of nightmares, most frequent nightmares that people have. But one of those that was in the top 10 is missing an important event. And that's one that I have experienced several times in both my childhood when I would wake up or dream that I had missed a test or a pop quiz or something like that, and I was always a good student, and so that just stressed me to the max. Now, as a minister, as an adult, probably the most frequent kind of category I have there is forgetting that I was supposed to preach on Sunday and didn't prepare a sermon, or just show up and I've got to preach, and I'm not prepared for that, and it just kind of freaks me out. And so that's a nightmare that I have had, and maybe you've had a similar nightmare as well. Or maybe, and this is kind of be the topic of our conversation today, maybe for you, you missed an important event in the life of one of your church members. Maybe you missed an important surgery, or maybe you weren't there at a funeral of a family member, or maybe you weren't there to pray with them when they needed you, or whatever, but you have missed an important event. Brother, that is not just a hypothetical nightmare that you may have at night. That's a reality as a pastor, whether you're a full-time pastor, bivocational pastor, whatever you are. That's a reality. Sometimes we may miss important events. And so how do you avoid that? How do you address that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. We're going to be talking about how you as a pastor can take good notes so that you don't miss those important events in the life of your church members. And so we're going to have that conversation today on the show. And so I'm joined today by Jeff Crabtree. Jeff's been on the show before. Jeff is the South Central Regional Consultant for the Kentucky Baptist Convention. At least he was at the time of this recording. However, he's stepping away. He's retiring from that role at the end of September. We're so grateful for his ministry. But he's going to talk to us about this particular issue. How do you take good notes? And why is that important? So I know you're going to be blessed by this conversation, and I know that this is going to be helpful to you as you serve your flock well. So sit back and relax and enjoy my conversation with Jeff Crabtree. All right, Jeff, welcome back to the Starting Well podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, Jason.
Well, Jeff, you wrote an article for us, again, on startingwell.net, and this one is maybe a topic that people don't think about that often, but I think is very important, and it's for a new pastor to maintain good records of your pastoral care to your flock. And so, again, that article is on startingwell.net. You can find it there. But, Jeff, as we get started, one of our Starting Well priorities, as you know, is to love well. And obviously, providing pastoral care is one of the best ways to show love for your flock. But many pastors, at least in my experience, struggle to do that. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think first they just not thought about it. I mean, I think they go and do, but the recording part of what they're doing or keep those records, they've just not thought about it. I think that's possible. I did have a pastor once that told me that he didn't want to keep records because he didn't want somebody keeping him accountable, i.e., deacons or leadership or things like that. So he looked at it from a purely negative perspective.
So, in your article, you talk about the importance of maintaining those records, and you mentioned three key questions about this topic. And so, I'd like to just kind of go through those three questions and let's just have that conversation. So, the first question that you mentioned is, why should I keep records of my pastoral care connections?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think the main reason is because as a pastor, we're accountable to the Lord to do the work. I mean, we're the under shepherd, and God doesn't need the records, but we need the records to be reminded of. I need to be accountable to follow up on that visit. Maybe it's something they've done. And the article I quoted, Hebrews 13:17, obey. It says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who have to give an account." And I think there's a truth to that. I mean, I know that's written to the church, but it's also written to the pastor, that we have an accountability to the Lord to fulfill our duty as pastor. And so I think to keep good records keeps me focused. It's not like the Lord calls me up every morning and says, "Jeff, I need you to make this visit, this visit, this visit," and follow up on that, because ministry happens and life happens and pastoral needs can fall through the cracks, because one need may kind of jump ahead of another. And so I think it's important that we keep good records. I just think it's handy that we keep those kind of things. Yeah.
I have found, at least in my own life, my own ministry, is I tend to forget things. And for me, taking those notes is a very helpful reminder for me, especially if you have a large congregation. It's just going to be very difficult to be able to remember all of the specific needs, all the specific occurrences, surgery dates, all that sort of stuff that's going on in the life that church member. And so it's just impossible for me to remember all that. So for me, it's such a help to understand I've got to take those notes that I can go back to and remind myself, okay, this happened in this church member's life in the past. They've got this particular challenge coming up and I want to be prepared for that. So it's just a huge help for me personally, not to try to have to remember all of that myself.
I was thinking about a pastor I served with down in Tennessee. He had remarkable memory. And if somebody's son came and visited with them at Christmas, he could remember their first name. And it was extraordinary how he did that. And I guess I watched Greg do that, and it kind of called me to kind of jot down notes. I carried Post-it notes in my Bible with me, and that way I can jot down those particular things and then put it in my bigger piece.
Yeah, that's good.
We'll get into the how in a little bit, okay?
That's right. And in fact, that's a good segue into the second question. Is we're not quite to the how yet, but in this question you ask, what pastoral care connections should I track? And you provide several areas. And so I've got them kind of bullet point listed here, and I'm just going to go through those. So the first one you mentioned is tracking church visitors.
I don't know that this is an extensive list. These are the ones that I would kind of keep. But those church visitors are just kind of keeping names and keeping those in front of you. I think that's an effective way to get that started into your follow-up process, your welcoming process. But I don't know. Every church does something a little different there. In my early days, we printed a bulletin. We'd have that tear off. And I would always have the ladies who printed that bulletin put the date on that tear off. And then simply the way I'd start is I would take those tear offs and I would fold them up in such a way that I had a date record. And that would begin my process, my workflow, if you will, of how I was going to do the follow-up process.
Yeah, absolutely. So church visitors is one that you would track. Another one you mentioned here is spiritual decisions.
I think this is probably a very important one. I've walked into a lot of churches, even as a staff member, and you walk in and you start talking about how many baptisms they had. And then I would ask a question and say, when somebody makes a profession of faith, what's that process? And I think there's a lot of churches that don't have a good follow-up process for baptism specifically, where somebody makes a profession of faith and we just couldn't get it worked out this week or next month, or some family member couldn't come and it falls through the crack. And if we don't have a good way to remind us of that baptism, I think a salvation thing too, especially significant salvation experiences of being able to keep up with who and where, and maybe following through some sort of ministry process with them. I think another one is, Jason, you've done such great work on calling out the call. You know, when someone comes forward with a decision during an invitation, or even in my office, if I don't follow up on that, they won't know how. I think it was you or Dr. Rice one was talking about how many men probably felt called into ministry, but they didn't know what to do with it. And it kind of got lost in the everyday. So I think these are imperative that we kind of grab those things to make sure that those things don't fall through cracks, because those decisions or those conversations that we have could fade away if we don't kind of keep that ball rolling. I think that's part of that account in Hebrews 13. I mean, we have an account to give to kind of keep up with the thing. I think those spiritual decisions are important.
Yeah, I think those are huge. So again, you've got this list of different things to track: church visitors, spiritual decisions. Another one that you mentioned here is MIAs, or missing in attendance.
Yeah, I mean, this comes from my old minister of education role when I think about those people that are missing in Sunday school or some of those kind of things. But, you know, I don't know about you, but I seem to be training more and more deacon ministries to do a family ministry plan. And if you've got some sort of stability that way to help a pastor out, if you're doing attendance through small group, for instance, or Bible study or whatever you call that, if you can pull that, you know, who have we not seen Bob and Sue? There's got to be a list that we say every month we need to be kind of on top of that. So I think it's important that there is some sort of care track on those folks too. Now, I know we've got several things here. I'm not looking to give a pastor a full-time job of doing this, but I think he's accountable to that. And he needs to have good reconnaissance, I guess you would say. You know, I think it's really hard to stand up and preach on Sunday morning and take attendance with your mind while you're trying to preach. But these missing in action folks could be identified through a deacon's family ministry plan, or a Sunday school or small group opportunity, or those leaders, you know, especially our leaders. If we start missing a significant leader in attendance on Sunday morning, we should be able to have some sort of mechanism there. So if we've got a note of those written down, then on Monday through Friday, maybe we get a few minutes to send a text or an email or a phone call or whatever that is. So.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point there, that for some of these, you're going to be the one that's tracking them. But for others of these, you can certainly enlist others in the congregation to help you. And this is a great example of one where you can't, as the pastor, be solely responsible for tracking this, but you need help from others. All right, so you've listed 3 thus far. Church visitors, you want to track those. You want to track spiritual decisions, missing in attendance. Another one that you listed in the article is family members' names.
Yeah, I think the family members' names are extremely important, especially when you think about small children that may be part of a family and mom and dad joined your church, so it's easy to keep up with them. And if they've got twins, I mean, that's always the hard one if they've got children close to age, you know, unless it's a boy and a girl. But giving you those crutches to be able to call them by name as they're walking down the hall, or stop and say something to them. I think another one is like Pastor Greg, who's down in Tennessee that I served with. He had the ability, if they came one time a year, he just had a phenomenal memory, and he could call so-and-so's grandchild's name, and he could pull that out. I can't. And so I realize I can't. So I might put that in a note and have that so that I can pull it back up, because if I know that I made a note of it and I can pull it back up, I'll probably be very apt to use that name. And it causes a powerful impression on people that you've remembered them.
Yeah, and I am like you, brother. I am terrible at remembering names. And I don't know how many times I've been in a church and I'm 85 to 90% sure I remember their name, but because there's that 10% of doubt, I won't use it. And so, yeah, having a note of that is very helpful. That even if the first encounter you're not able to recall that name, well, maybe during the service you pull that up and see what their name is, and then at the end of the service, as they're leaving, then you can use their name and tell them that it was so good to see them.
I think another one too is that sometimes we get called to a hospital visit or to the funeral home with an extended family situation. And so you may want to check on grandma who's a member of a sister church or out of town. And you've got that note that you can call grandma's name. I think that's a very important thing that we can do there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so another pastoral care connection that you mentioned that you should track is current and potential leaders.
I love this one. I think it's important for us to keep our pipeline of leadership going. And so if we've got a track of, like all of our deacons, when's the last time I saw them? I've got that list. So, if you're in a large, middle size or larger church, or you're new to that particular congregation, there's some lists that I would have. And then I would have a potential leaders list. And that potential leaders list would be like if I'm walking through Vacation Bible School, for instance, and I see someone that's a helper or doing that, I'm going to ask a question. I've never seen them work in the church before. What's their next step to get into this leadership pipeline? And so I think that's important. I don't know about you, but churches that struggle finding new deacon candidates, I think that's huge, is because you get your back against the wall because you know that next month we're going to nominate so many deacon candidates. And as pastor, have you thought about that? And so if you're continually watching your congregation and you can put them into some kind of note that you say, I could see them in a few years doing X, or I think they would make a good Y. Or if somebody joins your church and they may come from a sister church and had been a deacon or had served in a ministry there for a long, long time, I'm going to put them in that potential leader group so I can watch them and vet them and keep up with them. So I just think it helps in that pipeline piece. And I think that's part of pastoral care is placing people in their right role. I know that kind of blends the lines with leadership, but if as pastoral care, our job is to help the saints do the work of the ministry. And so I just think that's a great spot.
Yeah, I agree 110%. You've got to always kind of have that running list. And this is great for me to think about because normally I kind of keep that list in my head, but I love your suggestion to actually write it down. And that can also become just an opportunity for you to pray for the next few months. As you kind of review that over and over again, you can pray and just ask the Lord for wisdom there or to begin to impress upon their heart that role. And there's so many benefits to keeping that written down. So you list one more thing to track. You want to keep track of those important dates or milestones in the life of your church members.
Yeah, I think this depends upon the guy. For me, one of the things that I try to keep up with is a significant death. So a spouse's death, a child's parent's death, maybe something like that. There could be even the important dates of somebody saying, well, I've put off surgery, a major surgery till November, and here it is mid-August. Both, what we're going to do if we don't write that down, if we don't put those dates down, it's going to be. But I think losses, anniversaries of some kind, those kind of things, remembering those moments to show love and compassion, because that pastoral side for some of our guys, especially the preacher guys, the guys that are gifted in preaching, sometimes the pastor side is just the second piece to their puzzle, but the primary piece is the preaching. But man, if you can get into keeping these pastoral notes and developing what you want to track, it will help you to not only be a good preacher, but a better pastor.
So we've talked so far about why you should do this, what you should track, but then we've alluded to this several times, but now we're going to deal with this third and final question that you address in the article. How should I track my pastoral care connections?
I think you'll probably grow in that, but I think the first thing you need to do is don't jump in the deep end of the pool. Kind of start where you are. And so, to start where you are sometimes, depending on the size of your church, if you're not an electronic guy, maybe it's with index cards and a index card box. That's a good place to start. Maybe it's with the Notes app on your phone that you've developed several different kinds of notes. But, developing that system for you has got to be kind of in your wheelhouse, in your flow. Or like I said a minute ago, I keep Post-it notes for that reason. Inside the flap of my Bible, I've got just 5 or 6 Post-it notes. And I'll jot down stuff like that. And it's just something that I don't have to worry about losing. And then on Monday, when I open up my Bible, there's my notes. And so that I can kind of work with those as I see. If I'm a young guy and I'm just starting in, I'm going to push in to figure out some way to do it digitally, because that way it kind of encapsulates everything you're going to pick up. So if you're a tablet guy and a computer guy and a phone guy, it's all there. You don't have to worry about moving it around.
Yeah, and I certainly lean more towards the digital side, just personally in my preference. For years, I kept a lot of these notes either in a Word document on my computer or even in an Excel spreadsheet. I've tracked them there. And you could list all of your church members in one column and then the dates that you've had some type of pastoral care to them and some of the things that Jeff has talked about. One thing that I've used in recent years, and by the way, this is not an endorsement for this particular tool, but it's something that I've discovered over the past couple of years that's been helpful for me. And it's an app that is designed to take pastoral care notes called Notebird. And I've used this for a couple of years. And if you are digitally inclined, you may want to look into it because it will help you remember some of the milestones that Jeff has talked about. It will help you remember when their baptism was. You can put that in there, and then it will remind you every year when it's coming up on that anniversary. And so you could send them just a quick text, say, hey, I know it's been 5 years this week since you were baptized, and I'm just so thankful, and I still praise the Lord for that day and for your continued walk with the Lord. And that's a very small gesture, but man, that goes such a long way for that church member to say, wow, my pastor actually remembers that it's been 5 years since he baptized me. And that'll speak volumes to them. And so an app like that will help you to remember those things. And so again, may not work for you, but that's a tool that I've used that is very helpful.
The thing I like about Notebird, and you introduced me to Notebird, Jason, one day when we were at KBC building. And the more I look into that is, we were talking a few minutes ago about it's hard for one pastor to do all of this care stuff. And so with Notebird, you can buy the ability to give multiple users that same app, and you can be the administrator. And let's say you give a group of deacons certain names to run down, and you can see their reports back and forth to keep you involved in that. Or if you've got other staff people, and you can give them tasks and you can pull that up. So it's not an expensive piece either. I mean, it may cost you $150, $200 a year to have that, but man, it's such a blessing. And the other thing I would say is many churches today that have some sort of electronic data system, some of those new data systems have notes and things in it that you can use, and you need to make sure about this, but many of them will lock those notes down exclusively to you. So if Jason, if you and I were both on staff, I could see my notes, you couldn't see my notes, and I couldn't see yours. But the other thing is they have what's called workflows in them in some of these data systems that it would allow you to do this too. So, a Notebird system may not be is useful for you. I'm thinking about, have you used Planning Center, Jason?
No, I haven't.
So Planning Center, and I'm not endorsing this either. I'm just knowing that I've been on church staffs that have used those. You know, we used an electronic piece in the last church I was on staff that I could set up those workflows and give people tasks, and I could keep up with them. And you could use those for pastoral care too, especially if you had a team. But, you know, many electronic data systems, if you look at it, Planning Center has an add-on that you could put on. So for a few dollars more a month, you could put that in so that maybe all of your deacons could have their family ministry plans and have one hub for everybody to report in. The only problem is if you got old Gus who doesn't have electronics, you know, you may have to help old Gus. But, you know, I do think it works out really well, and it's very effective for that. We take our phone with us everywhere.
So regardless of your ability to use electronics, we've given you different options. You can use Post-it notes. You can write all this down in a journal or a notebook. You could use kind of in the middle ground, maybe just a Word document on your computer or an Excel file. Or if you want to get a little more sophisticated, then you could use Notebird or Planning Center, or there are other tools out there. These are just a couple that we've mentioned, just so that you know that there are options on the table that are relatively affordable. So I think the takeaway here is your system is your system, and it can look different, but you need to have a system of some sort.
That's right. That's right. And you know, let me throw two things out at you in this area for the last. Is number one, I think it's got to be intentionality. You got to be intentional with it. And the second thing is you may find an older pastor somewhere, and then somebody, you know, if you're a new pastor and you're just starting out, find that oldest pastor in your association who's been pastoring for a long time, that's a great pastor, and go ask him how he keeps up with it. And you may not like his system, but I think you'll find that he's got a system. I would be surprised if a guy didn't. And then kind of work from there. Maybe find you a guy that can help mentor you and how to do that, and encourage you to do it.
So, Jeff, what would you say to a pastor who, for different reasons, maybe they're bivocational or they've just got a lot on their plate, what would you say to that pastor who is struggling to find time to document his pastoral care?
Well, I get that, but I think you do what's important. And I think if you see that pastoral care is important, you'll find a way to do that. And, you know, the thing about it is, if you're an electronics person, if I'm driving down the road today, I can open up a note on my cell phone and hit record while I'm driving and dictate, hey, I went to see John Doe at the hospital today. And it's that simple. I mean, there's certain things like that could be done kind of on the fly. So I think there's ways to do that. I think the other one is just scheduling. I think you've just got to say, okay, on Wednesday night when I get home from church, I'm going to record those. And I don't think it's going to be like you're going to have 100 records a week, but I think you can find time.
All right. One of the last questions I typically ask is resources. So are there one or two resources that you would recommend to help a pastor in this area?
To be real honest with you, I'm a Gary McIntosh fan. I've got everything he's ever done. Two of his books, I think, have chapters in them that speak to this. One is What Every Pastor Should Know. That's a desktop version of a book I think that every pastor ought to have on their desk. But there's a chapter in there about pastoral care. And then in that book, The 10 Key Roles of Pastors, he's got a chapter on being the counselor, which kind of fits into this as well. So I think those are two great things. I think the other one I mentioned, besides the digital things, I think the resource of a Notebird or something like that, checking with your data system that you're using is I'll be honest with you. I think if I were sitting in an associational meeting with a group of pastors, I would say, guys, you know, I've thought about keeping up with pastoral visits. How do you do it? And start listening to other guys that are doing it and finding that guy that maybe you have a kindred spirit with, and maybe he can help you or, you know, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good word. And again, Pastor, all the resources that Jeff has mentioned here, We will have links to those in the show notes, and you can access the resources there. We'll put a link to Notebird and some of the others that we've mentioned just so that you can check them out and see if it might work for you. Well, Jeff, this has been a great conversation. Grateful for you, brother. Thank you for your ministry, and thank you for joining us on the Starting Well podcast.
Thanks, Jason. My pleasure.
Thanks again to Jeff Crabtree for joining us on this episode. And thank you as well. I know that you've got plenty of things that you could be doing, and so I consider it an honor and a privilege that you would take a few minutes out of your day to listen to these conversations. And I pray that they are helpful to you. So join us again next week as we continue having conversations to help you start well in your ministry. Until next time, may you shepherd the flock of God among you well. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Starting Well podcast. For more resources, please visit us online at startingwell.net. For more information about the Kentucky Baptist Convention, go to kybaptist.org.